Adventures in Supply Chain podcast is pleased to announce the Coronavirus and Supply Chain series to help our communities with the insights of outstanding leaders in supply chain and in other critical functions. These challenging times are also for transformations and opportunities. We will get through this together and we will make it happen. It's our pleasure to introduce Ron Volpe. Ron is a design thinking-driven senior leader who has successfully led and transformed very large and global CPG supply chains from manufacturer, Kraft Foods, to shelf, Coles Australia, across 30 countries. Ron's previous experience includes platform-enabled digitization of the shared supply chain in his role as Chief Supply Chain Evangelist at the Fintech startup Tradeshift. Key areas of his expertise are CPG, leadership, supply chain, business development, transformation, design thinking, board advisor, and global best practices. Ron's supply chain design work has been featured in the books The 10 Faces of Innovation by IDEO's Tom Kelley and Creative Confidence by IDEO's Tom Kelley and David Kelley. And now with you, your host, Marcia, and her amazing guest, Ron Volpe.
Hello, Ron. A pleasure and an honor to have you here in the show. So welcome.
Thank you very much. It's an odd time to be doing podcasts. I'm doing this from my kitchen. Obviously, we're still under quarantine here in California. So it's nice to be here, Masha.
I'm glad that you join us. And you have such a great and impressive experience with supply chain transformations, with digitalization. So we would like to know the benefits that technology can bring to supply chain.
So I've had a fairly eclectic career, and I was having this discussion with somebody recently. I think there are people that have spent a lot of their career in one functional area, and there are people in careers that spend all of their career across a broad array of a particular functional area, and I think I've done the latter more than the former. So it's been an interesting career and exciting career. I'll give you the really small snapshot of it, and we can dive into any questions you might have. So it's heavy on food and supply chain and transformation, and most recently in the technology field. So many years with Kraft Foods in a number of locations, managing the global center of excellence and leading that area, as well as leading the strategy shop within supply chain for Kraft. And then a number of years with Coles, which is a big grocery retailer in Australia, and leading supply chain and transformation and business development at Coles. And then most recently with Tradeshift, which is a Fintech company based here in San Francisco, startup in San Francisco, and leading the build out of the app ecosystem, as well as kind of the resident Chief Supply Chain Evangelist for Tradeshift. And then even more recently, so over the last couple of months, have been focused on helping startups in the supply chain space, as well as working on the COVID response out of the University of Southern California. So a wide array, and in the middle of all of that, spent a lot of time with doing design work with IDEO in Palo Alto, where we did a kind of partnership joint venture when I was with Kraft. And I think that informs a lot of the way I think about supply chain from a design thinking perspective. So I'll pause there, take a breath, and take a sip of coffee, and then let you go.
Excellent. And I'm glad that you have such vast experience and diverse with companies that differ in size, and you mentioned that in particular you have great experience in food, so that's perfect. And what I would like to know is what have you seen as benefit of this digital transformation? First, to help us understand what they are, because we have heard this like digital transformation, but we don't know much what it entails, right? Maybe some people think about robots, some others other aspects, but we would like first to know clarification of what it means when we talk about digital transformation, And then if you could explain more based on your experience about the benefit that could bring to the company.
Yeah, so I'll take a step backward and answer that in a couple of ways. So, and I'll try not to give you a word soup of things like IoT and AI and blockchain, and I'll try not to go down that path. And I think food is a really interesting place to come from when you think about digitization. And what I mean by that is, I come from largely big food and big supply chains, so manufacturer, retailer, and what I've found is that although supply chains and global supply chains, food and throughout FMCG, I think have become more and more complicated. And what used to be a kind of a one-to-one transaction many, many years ago is now kind of a many-to-many transaction when you think about supply chains. Supply chains have gotten infinitely more complex to manage. And there are many benefits that come from that, the complexity. One is innovation. When you have, I'll use the Apple iPhone 11 as an example, there's something on the order of 500 different suppliers between when the raw materials are collected and when that product gets into somebody's hand. So if you think about 500 players and the coordination that needs to go on to get all those parts to the right place, to the manufacturing facility in China, and then back out to consumers, it's a massive undertaking. What comes from that, call it specialization of supply chains, is innovation. I think there's cost opportunities that come out as a result of that. Those are all great. I think what happens though is it becomes more complex. I think the challenge for supply chain, and we can dive into this after I say this, I think the challenge for supply chain, particularly in this kind of post-COVID period, is although the complexity has grown, the technology being utilized to manage that complexity has not kept pace. And what I don't suggest is that the technology doesn't exist. What I suggest is because of change management challenges, because of leadership challenges, because of adoption challenges in organizations, companies have, in many cases, stayed well behind the curve in terms of using technology to manage the complexity. There are exceptions. Apple's a great exception that uses technology to manage that complexity. But coming from food, I would say that I think we have a ways to go in terms of managing that complexity correctly. And I think that, and then I'll close that statement off, I think COVID's a real black swan event in the sense that I think it's a catalyst that's going to force change in the industry. I've been writing an article for a supply chain periodical in London recently, and that's one of the challenges I call out, and that I think the bar is going to be set much higher than it has been as we go forward, and I think it's incumbent upon corporate organizations to think about how they're going to manage that, because we can't manage supply chains that are built for today the way we managed them 25 or 30 years ago, but that exists, not just in food. I think, across industry, there are far more that are not leveraging technology than are leveraging technology.
Yes, and you mentioned, Ron, about innovation. And I was thinking while you were mentioning that for food is critical with new product introductions, right, to get fast to the market. So by not leveraging technology and see all the supply chain, what you were mentioning about the complexities involved, well, companies can be missing a big part, right? There can be more mistakes, and also they can be slower in getting to the market, and their competitors can do it faster, right?
Yes. And I read an article recently about, and it related to COVID. So I'll tie this to the work I'm doing at USC. I read an article recently that was about a gentleman in New York whose parents had immigrated from India many years ago, and his father had passed away from COVID recently, a really sad article. And what he said was he didn't expect to have to mourn for the notion of a supply chain. And I thought that was a really compelling statement, a really poignant statement, and super sad statement in the sense that I think although consumers want new, better, more cutting edge kind of products, interesting products, I I think what consumers also want is safety in their supply chain. And they want to get products that they expect to get on time at the right time. And I don't know that we can continue to do that well unless we continue to grow and leverage technology in a much bigger way. And I'll relate it outside of food. I'll relate it to the healthcare industry and this work we're doing at USC. The problem with the issue with this individual in this story I gave you was that they couldn't get the testing swabs in time to determine that he had COVID because the supply had run out. So that's what his comment came from. They couldn't get testing swabs. So I think what we're doing with USC and with that team there is, how do we look at this from a very different angle in healthcare? Because healthcare, even more acutely, I think we need to make sure that the supply chain is managing to make sure that critical supplies, critical medications, all of that gets to the people that need them at the right time.
Yes, so you are talking like about traceability, right? To know where they are. And yes, when you mention this, I'm considering, for example, this new technology, or not new, but relatively new, that is blockchain, right? That allows to know that, to track the issues, to pinpoint them faster, right?
Yeah, and I mean, I give you a couple examples on the on traceability. So one of the companies I happen to be doing some advising right now is a company called Persicor, based out of Copenhagen, that does work in the track and trace space. It does real serialized track and trace, which is really, really interesting work in terms of, and particularly in regulated industries, is really interesting work. That's just one example of many, many, many companies doing really, really interesting work in supply chain. The challenge is, how do we make that story easy for organizations, big and small, to understand how to get on board with? And during my time at Tradeshift, one of the things I used to talk to companies about was, we've got to make it easier for companies to understand and find the on-ramp to digitization. The answers are there, but companies, whether it be a cost issue or whether it be a change management issue or whether it be just don't know where to get started, or leadership, and I think that's another example. I think companies need to understand how to do that in a simple way. They need a blueprint of how to do that. I think, so go to my example about Persicor and others, there's really, really interesting work. The technology is there to manage this better. We've got to get it in the hands of the right people. And we've got to get the right people leading that change within organizations to make sure it sticks.
Yes. So would you say that is the investment that companies need to make, that sometimes they are reluctant to do it, or is more related to change management? Because these transformations take some time. So they need to make sure that they have all the resources in place to make them happen.
Honestly, I think it's a function of those and other things. So I think some of the big ones are change management. I think that's a huge piece of it. And I think it's also a case of investment. I mean, I think, and I think of one instance I was involved in the last 10 years or so where with the rate of turnover of senior leadership in some organizations, the notion of investments that don't have a payout for 5 or 10 years, you have decisions being made within boardrooms that suggest, if you've got a CEO that thinks, I'm only going to be here 3 more years, do I really want to invest this much money to get, a particular level of digitization? Does it pay back for shareholders? I think those kind of decisions are being made on a day-to-day basis. And I think we've just got to think bigger. A colleague, and I like to call him a friend, at the London School of Business, Gary Hamel, who's done great work in terms of innovation and thinking. Several years ago, he put an article out called Moonshots for Management that I still pull out all the time. And it talks about what are the things that need to change in leadership? What are the things that need to change for us to really make a step change in how organizations are led? I think we need to go back to thinking like that, to say, we really have to have leadership that says, this is bigger than just what's the next year's profits look like. This is a bigger story. And that's why I go back to the notion of digitization. And again, I'm intentionally staying away from talking about the relative merits and execution of blockchain and IoT and AI. All of those are, because I do think people sort of get lost in that sense, in terms of it's a bit of, as I said, a word soup of stuff, and that's the way all articles are talking about. I do think that companies need to think about what are the problems I've got to solve, and how do I solve them in a very different manner. Because I think as I said, the answers are there, and I don't think consumers, whether in food or in healthcare or elsewhere, I don't think consumers, especially coming out of COVID, are going to have the same level of expectation. I think the bar will be set in a different place, and I think organizations are going to find that their competitiveness and their competitive advantage is going to come from managing those supply chains in a much better way. There was I'll say one more thing and I'll take a breath. There was a year or so ago, I was doing a presentation someplace, and I did a bit of a rough study of companies that had ex-supply chain chiefs as CEOs and companies that didn't, and companies that had invested in technology and those that didn't. And I think that the ratio was something on the order of 50 or 75 to 1 of companies that had those characteristics around supply chain and had positive earnings reports versus those that did not have positive. And the number of articles and earnings reports that called those supply chain problems, they gravitated toward companies that didn't have that level of expertise and the type of expertise at the top of the house. And if you look at places like Apple, you got Tim Cook, who's an ex-supply chain officer. I don't think it's an accident that they've invested in the right places and made the right investments, and are looking at this with a longer purview.
Yes, yes, no, that's an excellent example. And when you mentioned to do this transformation, that probably COVID-19 is going to accelerate digital transformations. So why do you think it's a good time to invest, and how are they going to think in putting aside funds that at the same time they are seeing that sales go down in many companies?
Yeah. Well, and look, companies are always going to make do an ROI on the investment they're going to get on anything, whether it be technology or something else. I think those calculations are going to be made, no doubt. But I do think that the two buckets that I think of in terms of the why of companies investing like this, one is I think there's a competitiveness component. So I think that companies are going to look at companies that have done this kind of transformation or gone down this path, look at how they've performed over time. They're going to want to be more like that. It can't just be about immediate short-term costs and profits. I think it's going to be about that long-term reputation and reputational value of organizations. I think the other piece is just the notion of getting the right products to the right consumers and managing the complexity of global supply chains. I think just in terms of hitting their normal supply chain objectives, I don't think that they're going to have the luxury of sitting back and continuing to manage the way they have. I mean, let's talk about food for a second, because it's an industry I know fairly well. I think if you look at North America, and you've got a couple of players that are quite dominant in the food retailing food capacity space. You've got Walmart at one end, and you've got Amazon at another end, and in the middle you've got a whole bunch of other grocery retailers at play. I think that there's an existential threat that exists for those retailers that sit in the middle of that, because Amazon has obviously got one model that works very well. Walmart's got a somewhat different model that works very well. Everybody else has got to distinguish themselves in some way, and I think one of the things they're going to have to do for that landscape to look competitive for everybody in 5 years, I think all of them are going to have to think differently about how they manage supply chains. And I think that it's not always going to be about the cost component as Walmart looks at it. I think if changes are not made, I just feel like that field is going to look very much smaller. In other countries, the landscape is similar. It's slightly different. I spent a lot of time in Australia. I understand that market fairly well as well. You don't have Amazon really heavy. You don't have any Walmart, but you do have players like Aldi that have come into the market, and I think are bringing some new technology. And I think that there's a competitiveness and a competitive threat that exists if you don't get on board and start this journey. And it doesn't need to be look, you're going to go from nothing to where Apple in terms of level of complexity. You've got to find a place to dig in. And I was thinking about this, our discussion this morning before we got online here, and I was thinking about there's an article 20 years ago that I remember from the food industry that talked about the paradox of choice, and what that meant was consumers are, and it was in Harvard Business Review, I think, and it suggested that retailers are giving consumers too much choice, and the average grocery store has 40,000 items in it, and there are just too many decisions and too much choice to make. And as I think there's an analogy I draw to tech right now. And what I mean by that is there's a lot of players out there doing some really amazing stuff and some brilliant minds that are driving change and driving innovation into the tech space that will absolutely help us manage supply chain better. But I think we've got to help companies find a way to understand that landscape, understand the difference between different players talk track and trace, I'll talk visibility. Different players play differently in slightly different niches within that space. I think we've got to make it easier for companies, small companies, mid-sized companies, big companies, to understand the relative merits of both of those. I also think, and this is something that a lot of companies are doing, and I think TradeLedge is a good example of one that does this quite well, is how do you create an ecosystem of applications that helps companies manage their supply chain challenges and pain points more holistically? So how do you create kind of an end-to-end solution of supply chain applications that are housed in the cloud that allow companies to always have best-of-breed players and have interoperable applications that really take them to the next level? And there are companies, and I'm just going to ramble across a couple of names that come to mind. I mean, I talk a lot with the people at Corning, and Corning is a good example for me of a supply chain organization that really, really wants to find the most cutting-edge technology to manage their supply chain. But I think what they don't want to do, and I think that the way I articulate it is, you don't want to have 20 different big installs being made into your organization that you're going to have to live with for the next 10 years. You'd like to find an array of interoperable best-of-breed applications that you can manage supply chain that are always changing, they're always refreshing, and that today track and trace is this, but in 2 years there's a new company that's doing something really amazing. How do you make it so it's more plug and play, and organizations can have an on-ramp to get to the ecosystem that helps them manage this in a really holistic manner? I think, and I talk a lot about, here in California, and obviously I'm quite close to Silicon Valley. I think that I've had a lot of discussions in the last couple of months about, how do we help companies get to that place? And like I said, Apple maybe doesn't need that help, but there's SMEs, there's mid-sized companies that really do need that. And, over the last couple of months, as I've started managing this group of startups, I think I'm hearing the same thing, that they aren't sure how to get to the right players and decision makers. Those companies aren't really quite sure how to make heads or tails of this array of great technology. How do we help bring those two together?
Those are so great points, because when you talk about, like, companies may feel overwhelmed with all the options. I remember it was funny because when you were talking about the different options that the grocery store, the major retails are offering, I remember when I got here, well, actually in Michigan in 2003, and I went to the store to Mayor at that time, and I saw so many that I didn't know which one to pick, and I spent time, and that caused stress. And continuing, leaving that analogy, the companies, to hear about different options, new options, is not clear. And sometimes I have seen that there are applications to resolve the same issue. So there's an overlap. So I totally agree to see that holistically. And another point that I would like to add is that sometimes happens when companies acquire other companies, there are other systems, so then everything becomes more complex. So I think you made fantastic points with your explanation.
And look, I think you hit it right in the head. And I think that, and again, I'll try this out and see how it sounds. I think that, let's talk about FMCG and CPG firms. I think there's a heavy marketing component to the leadership of those organizations. I've worked in those organizations. And supply chain guys, and this is a generalization, like supply chain men and women, and this is a bit of a generalization, would like to have fewer SKUs, not more SKUs. I think it's just easier to manage. It's more costly to manage it that way. Marketing people, again, a generalization, are going to want as many different things as possible. And so, but consumers don't want to have to make those decisions. Again, let's use grocery store shopping. Consumers don't want to have that many decisions to make when they go into a supermarket. I think, and I go back to my earlier analogy about tech startups and supply chain startups. In this case, it's slightly different in the sense that I don't know that a lot of different pods of innovation are bad. I think that's great. I don't know. I'm going to take a bit of that analogy from the article about the paradox of choice. I think that a lot of companies is good to get big ideas. I think we just need to make it easier for companies to understand what each of them do in relative terms, and how do you package that up in an ecosystem that helps them manage it more holistically. So it's an exciting. I mean, it's a super exciting time to be thinking about supply chain, and it's a tragic and sad event of the COVID that's going to accelerate that. But I think that what has previously been kind of an option or a decisionable point for companies, I think is going to increasingly become a non-decisionable point as the impact on people globally of supply chain breakdowns becomes much more than, I'm going to make this up, I didn't get my gold iPhone this week. It's going to be much more, it's about life or death kind of decisions that are being made. And that story I gave earlier about the gentleman that passed away and his son talking about the mourning for a supply chain. I think it's a challenge. I think it really is a challenge for the supply chain world. Yeah. I'll just build on that just slightly. I think there's also a story, and this is, I'm still thinking through this, but there's also a story about how do you embed the cost of doing the right thing in the price of a product. So, I talk a lot with, although it's not my area major, but issues with sustainability, issues with human rights in supply chain, slave labor in supply chain, building out a regenerative food supply chain. All of those things, I think, are the right things for us to be doing in supply chain, in addition to making it easier to manage. I think that what we've got to figure out is, how do you package that up so people understand that, and I'm not sure what the right phrase is, but the not the political cost, but the cost of a product should embed making this the item a value and a positive thing for society. So I think that's a challenge that friends of mine are wrestling with in different spaces. I think it's also part of the story, because I do think technology can play a role in that as well. I think there are technologies out there that are able to identify if you've got slave labor in your supply chain throughout it. And there's now technology where before you could say, I just don't understand it, I don't have visibility that deep. Well, now you can create visibility. So how do you make sure that now that you've got that data, you're doing something about it? And because I think in one of the things that tech brings is technology brings in supply chains is a quid pro quo that here's the data, you've got a lot of data that's valuable to run your supply chains, but you've also now got a responsibility to do something about data that may reflect negatively on your supply chain. So look, the supply chain world, technology obviously has and will continue to, has in the past and will continue to revolutionize how we do supply chain. And to my earlier point, there's the distance between the haves and have-nots in this space is growing. And I think it's, and again, I'll use that term, existential threat for many companies that just haven't figured out a way how to get on that journey. So.
Yes, exactly. And Ron, what would you say to those companies that are watching this episode and they are considering to go ahead and do a digital transformation? What are the key factors to get a successful rollout?
Yep. Look, I think it's an understanding of the capabilities that exist. I think it's the right leadership skills. I think it's got to be there's got to be a feeling in the organization that says we're going, we're doing new things. We're going to get it right most of the time. We're not going to get it right some of the time, and there's got to be an acceptance of that. And going back to some work I did when I was working with IDEO when I was at Kraft, I think that one of the things they talked about is fail often to succeed sooner. I think that there's got to be a bit of a test and learn mentality that exists in organizations, because if you're just getting on the journey, you can get advice of what you think you need. But the reality is, I think you've got to be open to the fact that it's a journey and there's got to be 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But the reality is, there's just amazing stuff being done in from a technology perspective for supply chain. Digitizing, and I've almost intentionally stayed away from the word digitizing, but the reality is digitizing supply chain has never been more important. And one of the reasons is, just give a random data fact, 80% of the data you need to manage a supply chain resides outside of your supply chain. So the key is you've only got 20% of the data you need to make good decisions that reside in your supply chain. Integrating your data and digitizing across your end-to-end supply chain, I think, is a critical thing for you to really manage it effectively. There's such power with data. There's such power with technology and digitization that comes. It's not a case of it doesn't exist. There's not a case that the solutions to some of the problems out there don't exist. The situation is we're not getting there quick enough. And I think we've got to find a way to make that easier, make those decisions easier for leaders.
No, that's fantastic, Ron. And I really appreciate all the insights. It has been an honor to have you with such impressive accomplishment. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me, Masha. I really appreciate it. I enjoyed it a lot.
I enjoy our conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.